The silence had become Declan Zimmerman's armor, his shield, his punishment a self-imposed prison that started the day they lowered his brother into the red earth outside Ventura, California, and he realized words had failed him when they mattered most. 7 months had passed since that March afternoon in 1878. 7 months since the last syllable had crossed his lips. 7 months since he had told anyone anything at all. The other ranch hands at the Double Creek Ranch had stopped trying to make conversation, stopped inviting him to poker games, stopped asking if he needed anything. They communicated with him through gestures now, through nods and hand signals, and Declan preferred it that way. Words were dangerous things. They could lie. They could promise what they could not deliver. They could fail to convince a headstrong younger brother that riding into town drunk on a Saturday night might end with a bullet in his chest over a card game gone wrong. The ranch stretched across the coastal hills of Ventura County, where the land rolled golden in summer and green in winter, where the Pacific Ocean breathed salt air across the valleys, and where cattle grazed on grass that grew thick after the seasonal rains. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that should have made a man grateful, but Declan moved through it like a ghost, doing his work with mechanical precision, eating his meals alone, sleeping in the bunkhouse with his face turned to the wall. The ranch owner, Samuel Porter, was a patient man who had known Declan since he was 16, who had given both Zimmerman brothers jobs when their father died and left them orphaned. He did not press Declan about his silence. He did not threaten to let him go. He simply watched with sad eyes and let time do whatever work time could do. It was late October when everything changed, when the stage from San Francisco arrived in Ventura carrying mail, supplies, and a single passenger who would unravel 7 months of carefully constructed silence with nothing more than the sound of her laughter. Declan was in town that afternoon, one of his rare trips off the ranch, loading supplies into the wagon bed. He moved with efficient purpose, his hands rough and capable, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He was 26 years old but looked older, the grief having carved lines around his eyes and mouth that had not been there before. His dark hair needed cutting, and his jaw was shadowed with several days of stubble. He was tall and lean, built from years of hard work, and he moved with the easy grace of someone who spent more time with horses than people. The stage pulled up in front of the hotel in a cloud of dust, the horses snorting and stamping, the driver calling out as he set the brake. Declan barely glanced up. He had 3 more crates to load, and then he could return to the ranch, to the silence, to the work that kept his hands busy and his mind empty. But then she stepped down from the stage, and something made him pause. She was not the kind of beautiful that stopped men in their tracks, not at first glance. She was simply a woman in a dusty traveling dress, with dark hair pinned up under a sensible hat, carrying a worn carpetbag. But there was something in the way she moved, a kind of determined energy, a brightness in her eyes as she looked around the town, that made her seem more alive than anyone else on the street. Declan watched as she spoke to the stage driver, as she gestured toward the hotel, as she laughed at something the man said. The laugh was clear and genuine, carrying across the street, and it stirred something in Declan's chest that he immediately tried to suppress. He turned back to his work, hefting another crate, telling himself it was none of his concern who came or went from Ventura. But fate, or providence, or simple coincidence had other plans. 3 days later, Samuel Porter called Declan into the ranch house, a rare summons that made some of the other hands exchange glances. Declan went without expression, his hat in his hands, wondering if perhaps the patience had finally run out, if he was about to lose the only anchor he had left. Porter was behind his desk, and standing next to him was the woman from the stage. She looked different in the better light of the ranch house, younger than he had first thought, perhaps 24 or 25. Her hair was the color of chestnuts, rich brown with hints of red in the sunlight that came through the window. Her eyes were hazel, intelligent and direct. She wore a simple dress now, practical for ranch life, and she was watching him with undisguised curiosity. "Declan," Porter said, his voice gruff but kind, "this is Miss Tabitha Owens. She is my niece, recently arrived from San Francisco. Her father, my brother-in-law, passed away this spring, and she has come to stay with me and help manage the household. Tabitha, this is Declan Zimmerman, my best hand and the finest horseman in Ventura County." Declan nodded once, a brief acknowledgement, his eyes meeting hers for only a moment before sliding away. Tabitha extended her hand, a bold gesture for a woman, but there was nothing coy or affected about it. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, her voice warm, "I am pleased to meet you. Uncle Samuel speaks very highly of you." Declan looked at her outstretched hand, then took it briefly, his grip careful, his calloused palm rough against her softer skin. He nodded again, then released her hand and stepped back, waiting for whatever instruction Porter had for him. Porter cleared his throat. "I wanted to introduce you because Tabitha will be taking over the household accounts and will be managing the kitchen staff. She will also be joining us for meals in the main house. I am inviting the senior hands to dine with us on Sundays, and I expect you to attend." Declan's jaw tightened. He had been avoiding the main house for months, taking his meals with the other ranch hands in the bunkhouse, grateful for the anonymity of the crowded table where his silence went mostly unnoticed. The thought of sitting at Porter's table, of being scrutinized, of being expected to engage in social pleasantries, made his chest constrict, but Porter was not asking. His eyes held a firmness that Declan recognized. This was an order, given kindly, but an order nonetheless. Declan nodded once more, then waited to be dismissed. Tabitha was studying him with those intelligent eyes, her head tilted slightly. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said quietly, "I understand you knew my cousin, James Porter. Uncle Samuel told me he passed away some years ago. I am sorry for your loss." The words were kind, genuine, and they caught Declan off guard. James Porter had been Samuel's son, a good man who died in a riding accident when Declan was 19. It had been a terrible loss for the ranch, for everyone who knew him. But that was not the brother Declan grieved, not the silence he carried. He wanted to correct her, to explain, but the words tangled in his throat like barbed wire. He managed another nod, his expression carefully blank, and Porter, seeing his discomfort, intervened. "Thank you, Declan. That will be all. Sunday supper, 6 o'clock sharp." Declan turned and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his heart hammering in a way that felt both frightening and strangely exhilarating. He told himself it was just the stress of being put on the spot, of being forced back into social expectations he had abandoned. It had nothing to do with hazel eyes or a voice that sounded like music after months of silence. Nothing at all. The days leading up to Sunday passed in their usual rhythm. Declan worked from dawn until dusk, mending fences, breaking horses, moving cattle from one pasture to another. The October weather was perfect, cool mornings giving way to warm afternoons, the sky an endless blue dome overhead. The work was good, physical and demanding, and it kept him grounded. But he found himself thinking about Sunday supper more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it was dread, that he was simply dreading the ordeal of sitting at a formal table, of being watched, of having his silence be so obvious in a small gathering. But there was something else too, something he did not want to name, a strange anticipation that made him restless. Sunday arrived with a golden sunrise that painted the hills orange and pink. Declan went through his usual routine, but when the afternoon came, he did something he had not done in months. He went to the wash house and cleaned up properly, scrubbing away the dust and sweat, shaving carefully, trimming his hair as best he could with a borrowed pair of shears. He put on his cleanest shirt, the blue one his brother had always said made his eyes look darker, and he brushed the dust from his best trousers. When he looked at himself in the small, cracked mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. He looked almost civilized, almost like the person he used to be before grief had hollowed him out. The walk to the main house felt longer than usual, his boots crunching on the gravel path, the evening air carrying the scent of cooking meat and baking bread. His stomach twisted with nerves, and he almost turned back twice, but he kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other because Porter had asked and Porter deserved his loyalty. The main house was built in the Spanish style, with white adobe walls and a red tile roof, a wide veranda wrapping around the front. Warm light spilled from the windows, and Declan could hear voices inside, laughter and conversation that made him feel like an intruder before he even knocked. Porter opened the door himself, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Declan, right on time. Come in, come in." The dining room was more formal than Declan remembered, the table set with china and silverware that caught the lamplight. There were 5 place settings. Porter took the head of the table, and Tabitha sat to his right. The other 2 guests were already seated. Miguel Santos, the ranch foreman, a man in his 50s with silver threading through his black hair, and his wife, Rosa, a plump, cheerful woman who did the cooking and cleaning for the main house. Declan took the remaining seat, directly across from Tabitha, and immediately regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. She smiled at him, a warm, genuine expression that made her whole face light up. "Mr. Zimmerman, I am so glad you could join us." He nodded, his hands folded in his lap under the table, his expression carefully neutral. Rosa began serving the food, and the table filled with bowls and platters. Roasted beef, potatoes with butter and herbs, green beans, fresh bread still steaming from the oven, and a dried apple pie that smelled like cinnamon and home. It was a feast, the kind of meal that would have made Declan's mouth water in the old days, but now his throat felt tight, and he was not sure he could swallow past the knot of anxiety. Porter said a brief blessing, his voice sincere, and then conversation began flowing around the table. Miguel and Rosa talked about their grandchildren, about the new calf born that week, about the repairs needed on the south pasture fence. Porter asked Tabitha about her settling in, about whether she needed anything for her room, about her plans for reorganizing the household accounts. Tabitha answered with enthusiasm, her hands gesturing as she spoke, her eyes bright with ideas. She talked about her father's bookshop in San Francisco, about how she had helped him manage the accounts for years, about her plans to implement a similar system for the ranch. She was articulate and confident, clearly educated, and Declan found himself watching her despite his best efforts to keep his eyes on his plate. "And what about you, Mr. Zimmerman?" Tabitha said suddenly, turning her attention directly to him. "Uncle Samuel tells me you have a gift with horses." "How did you learn?" The table went quiet. Everyone knew Declan did not speak. Even Rosa, who was naturally chatty, held her breath, waiting to see what would happen. Declan felt heat rise in his face. He looked at Tabitha, saw genuine curiosity in her expression, no malice or mockery, just interest. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence stretched, became painful, and he saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "Oh," she said softly, "I am sorry, I did not realize." But Porter jumped in smoothly. Declan learned from his father, who was one of the best horse trainers in the state. The talent runs in the family. His brother was quite skilled as well. The mention of his brother hit Declan like a physical blow. His hands clenched under the table, his jaw tight, and he stared at his plate, willing himself to stay calm, to not stand up and walk out, to not do anything that would embarrass Porter or cause a scene. Tabitha must have sensed his distress because she changed the subject quickly, asking Miguel about the different breeds of cattle on the ranch, and the conversation moved on. But Declan could feel her watching him throughout the meal, her gaze thoughtful, curious. It should have made him uncomfortable, should have made him want to escape even more, but instead, it felt oddly like being seen, like being noticed in a way he had not been in a very long time. The meal progressed, and Declan managed to eat a bit, the food excellent even if his appetite was non-existent. He listened to the conversation flow around him, to the laughter and the easy camaraderie, and he felt like a stone in a river, water rushing past him but never quite touching him. Then Rosa told a story about one of her grandchildren, a little boy who had gotten into the chicken coop and emerged covered head to toe in feathers, convinced he could fly if he just tried hard enough. She acted it out, flapping her arms, puffing out her cheeks, describing the boy's absolute certainty that he was now a bird. And Tabitha laughed. It was not a polite, restrained laugh. It was full-throated and genuine, her head tilting back, her whole body shaking with mirth. It was the kind of laugh that was contagious, that made everyone else smile, that filled the room with warmth and light. Declan felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the wall he had built so carefully around himself. The sound of her laughter hit him like a physical force, breaking through the silence, reaching into the frozen place where he had been hiding. It was beautiful and real and alive, and it reminded him of everything he had been trying not to feel for 7 months. His eyes stung. His throat ached. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, and before he could stop himself, before he could think about it or second-guess or lock it down, words tumbled out of his mouth, rough and rusty from disuse, but words nonetheless. "That is a good story," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse and cracked, but unmistakable. The table fell silent. Every head turned toward him, eyes wide with shock. Porter's fork clattered against his plate. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. Miguel leaned forward as if he had not heard correctly, but Tabitha just smiled, her eyes soft with understanding, and said simply, "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman, I thought so too." And just like that, the spell was broken. Conversation resumed, carefully, as if everyone was afraid that making too big a deal of it would scare Declan back into silence. But something fundamental had shifted. The silence that had been his fortress for 7 months had cracked open like a walnut, and there was no putting it back together. Declan did not speak again during the rest of the meal, but when he caught Tabitha's eye across the table, she gave him a small, encouraging smile, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time: hope. The week following that Sunday supper passed in a strange blur for Declan. He kept expecting to regret having spoken, to feel exposed or vulnerable, to want to retreat back into the safety of silence. But instead, he felt lighter, as if a weight he had been carrying had shifted slightly, not gone, but more bearable. He did not seek out conversation. He still worked alone, still ate most of his meals with the ranch hands in the bunkhouse, still went to bed early and rose before dawn. But something had changed in how the other men treated him. They nodded more when they passed him, included him in plans with gestures that assumed he might respond, left space for him in conversations even if he did not fill it, and he found himself thinking about Tabitha Owens more than was probably wise. She was everywhere on the ranch now, her presence transforming the main house in ways both subtle and obvious. Flowers appeared on the veranda, bright splashes of color against the white walls. The windows stayed open more often, letting in fresh air and sunlight. The accounts office, which had been a dusty, neglected room, was cleaned and organized, and sometimes in the evening, Declan could see lamplight burning there as Tabitha worked over the ledgers. She also made a habit of walking around the ranch in the late afternoon, talking to the hands, learning names, asking about their work. She was friendly without being forward, curious without being intrusive, and the men responded well to her. Even the gruff, weathered cowboys who had spent decades working cattle found themselves smiling when she approached, answering her questions with surprising patience. Declan watched her from a distance, careful not to stare, but unable to help himself. She moved through the world with a confidence he envied, a sense of purpose and place that he had lost somewhere along the way. She was quick to laugh, quick to offer help, quick to roll up her sleeves and work alongside Rosa in the kitchen or help Miguel's wife tend the vegetable garden. And she asked questions, so many questions. Why do the horses wear those different bits? She asked Miguel one afternoon, standing by the corral fence. How do you know which cattle are ready for market? She asked one of the other hands. What are those birds called, the ones with the red wings? She asked Porter during supper. She was hungry to learn, to understand, to be part of this place, and her enthusiasm was infectious. Declan found himself lingering near the corral when he knew she might walk by, found himself working on projects closer to the main house, found himself hoping to catch a glimpse of her, to hear her voice, to witness that laugh again. It was dangerous, this fascination. He knew that. He had nothing to offer a woman like Tabitha Owens. He was a ranch hand with no prospects, a man broken by grief, a man who had forgotten how to use words for 7 months. She deserved someone better, someone whole, someone who could talk to her properly, who could make her laugh intentionally instead of accidentally. But knowing that did not stop his heart from jumping every time he saw her. The second Sunday supper was easier than the first. Declan arrived on time, cleaner and more prepared, and this time when he took his seat across from Tabitha, he managed to meet her eyes and nod a greeting. She smiled at him, that same warm, genuine smile, and said, "Good evening, Mr. Zimmerman. How was your week?" He hesitated, the words tangling in his throat, old habits dying hard. But then he forced himself to answer, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "Good. Yours?" "Wonderful," she said, her eyes lighting up. "I have been learning so much about ranch life. Did you know that cattle have best friends? Miguel told me they get distressed if separated from their preferred companions. I find that absolutely fascinating." Despite himself, Declan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "Did not know that," he admitted. "Well, it is true. I have been watching them in the pasture, and you can definitely see who prefers whose company. It is rather sweet, actually." Porter chuckled. "My niece is determined to document every aspect of ranch life. I believe she is composing a treatise." Tabitha laughed. "Not a treatise, uncle, just trying to understand my new home. Everything is so different from San Francisco. I love it." The meal proceeded much like the first, with conversation flowing easily. But this time, Declan found himself participating more, answering when spoken to directly, even offering a comment once when Miguel mentioned a problem with one of the horses. It was rusty and awkward, his social skills atrophied from disuse, but everyone was patient, giving him space to find his words, not rushing or pushing. And Tabitha, he noticed, had a gift for asking questions that only required short answers, for creating space in the conversation that was easy to fill without pressure. She did it so naturally that he did not think anyone else noticed, but Declan did, and he was grateful for it. After supper, Porter invited everyone to the veranda for coffee, and Declan almost declined, almost retreated to the safety of the bunkhouse. But Tabitha caught his eye and said, "Mr. Zimmerman, would you walk with me for a moment? I wanted to ask you something about the horses." It was not really a question, more of a polite command, and Declan found himself nodding, following her down the veranda steps and into the yard, where the evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of sage. They walked in silence for a few moments, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Declan waited for her question about horses, but instead Tabitha said quietly, "I owe you an apology." He looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For putting you on the spot at the first supper. Uncle Samuel had mentioned you were quiet, but he did not explain the extent of it, and I made you uncomfortable with my questions. I am sorry." Declan shook his head. "You did not know. Still, I should have been more observant. I pride myself on being perceptive, and I failed in that moment." She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Uncle Samuel told me about your brother, about what happened. I am truly sorry, Mr. Zimmerman. Grief is a terrible burden." The mention of his brother should have made him retreat, should have triggered the old defense mechanisms, but something about the way Tabitha spoke, the gentleness in her voice, made it bearable. "Thank you," he managed, his throat tight. They walked a bit further, the silence between them comfortable now, companionable. Then Tabitha said, "I lost my father this past spring. Cancer. He fought it for 2 years, and I watched him waste away, watched him suffer. When he finally passed, I felt this terrible mix of grief and relief, and the guilt of that relief nearly crushed me." Declan stopped walking, turned to face her. In the dim light, he could see the shimmer of tears in her eyes, the vulnerability in her expression. "I came here," she continued, "because I could not bear to stay in San Francisco in the house we shared, surrounded by his books and his things and his absence. I needed a fresh start, a new place where I could breathe again. Uncle Samuel has been incredibly kind to give me that opportunity." "I am sorry," Declan said, the words inadequate but sincere. "About your father. Thank you." She wiped at her eyes, then gave him a watery smile. "I suppose we are both refugees from grief in our own ways." He had never thought of it like that, but she was right. They were both here in this place, trying to find their way back to something resembling life. "It gets easier," Tabitha said softly. "Or so I am told. I have to believe that, or else what is the point of continuing?" Declan did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and they stood there in the gathering darkness, two broken people trying to figure out how to be whole again. Finally, Tabitha said, "I did actually want to ask you about horses. Uncle Samuel mentioned you might be willing to teach me to ride properly. I can manage a gentle horse at a walk, but I would like to learn to really ride, to be competent. Would you be willing to give me lessons?" The request caught him off guard. Teaching someone to ride meant spending time together, meant talking, meant interacting in ways he had been avoiding for months. It was risky and foolish and probably a terrible idea. "Yes," he heard himself say, "I can teach you." Her face lit up with genuine delight. "Really?" "Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. When can we start?" "Tomorrow afternoon," he said, committing before he could second-guess. "After your work is done, meet me at the corral." "I will be there," she promised. Then impulsively, she reached out and squeezed his arm, a brief, friendly gesture that somehow felt monumental. "Thank you, truly." And then she was walking back to the house, leaving Declan standing in the dark, his arm still tingling where she had touched him, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. What had he just agreed to? The next afternoon, Declan spent extra time selecting the right horse for Tabitha's lesson. He chose Dulce, a gentle mare with a patient temperament, the kind of horse that would tolerate mistakes and not spook easily. He brushed her until her coat gleamed, checked her hooves, adjusted her tack with careful precision. He was nervous, he realized. Actually nervous. Not about teaching. He had trained plenty of people to ride over the years, but about spending time with Tabitha, about the possibility of disappointing her or making a fool of himself. She arrived right on time, wearing a split riding skirt and boots that looked new, her hair braided down her back. Her face was bright with anticipation, and she practically bounced on her toes as she approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Zimmerman. Is this beautiful creature my teacher?" "This is Dulce," Declan said, stroking the mare's neck. "She is steady and forgiving, good for learning." "Hello, Dulce," Tabitha said, reaching out carefully to touch the horse's nose. Dulce snuffled at her hand, and Tabitha laughed with delight. "She is so soft." Declan found himself smiling despite his nervousness. "Let me show you how to mount properly." He walked her through the basics, explaining each step, demonstrating the correct way to approach the horse, where to place her foot in the stirrup, how to swing her leg over without spooking the animal. Tabitha listened intently, asking questions, trying to understand not just the mechanics but the reasoning behind each action. When she finally settled into the saddle, she looked down at him with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "I am so high up." "You are doing fine," he assured her. "Just relax. The horse can feel your tension." He led Dulce around the corral at a slow walk, one hand on the lead rope, talking Tabitha through the proper posture, how to hold the reins, how to communicate with her legs and seat. She was a quick study, her body adapting faster than most beginners, and within half an hour she was walking Dulce independently around the corral. "This is amazing," she called out, her face flushed with exertion and joy. "I feel like I could ride forever." "Do not get too confident," Declan warned, but he was grinning. "Tomorrow you will be sore in muscles you did not know you had." They worked for another hour, until the sun was getting low and Dulce was ready for rest. When Tabitha finally dismounted, she was breathless and happy, her eyes sparkling. "That was wonderful, Mr. Zimmerman. Thank you so much. When can we do this again?" "Same time tomorrow," he said, "if you are not too sore." "I will be here," she promised. Then she paused, looking at him with those disconcerting hazel eyes. "Do you think, perhaps, you could call me Tabitha? Mr. Zimmerman seems awfully formal for a teacher and student." He hesitated. Using her Christian name felt intimate, felt like crossing a line. But she was looking at him with such open friendliness that refusing seemed churlish. "Declan," he offered in return. Her smile was radiant. "Declan, I like that. It suits you." And then she was walking back to the main house, and Declan was left standing in the corral, his heart doing strange, complicated things in his chest. This was definitely dangerous. The riding lessons became a daily routine. Every afternoon, weather permitting, Tabitha would appear at the corral and Declan would work with her, teaching her the finer points of horsemanship. She was a dedicated student, practicing what he taught, asking thoughtful questions, pushing herself to improve. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. At first, it was just about horses and riding, technical discussions that felt safe. But gradually, as Tabitha grew more comfortable in the saddle, as the lessons became less about instruction and more about practice, the conversations expanded. Tabitha told him about growing up in San Francisco, about her father's bookshop, about the books she loved, and the dream she had harbored of perhaps becoming a writer someday. She talked about her mother, who had died when Tabitha was 12, about how she and her father had become a team navigating life together. Declan found himself sharing too, cautiously at first, but with increasing ease. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Monterey County, about his father teaching him to ride before he could properly walk, about his mother's death from fever when he was 10, about how he and his brother had worked their way through various ranches until landing at the Double Creek. He did not talk about his brother's death. Not yet. That wound was still too raw, too complicated, and he did not have the words for it yet. But Tabitha did not push. She seemed to understand instinctively where the boundaries were, what was safe to ask and what needed to be left alone. She was patient and kind, and her presence became something Declan looked forward to, the bright spot in his days. November arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first rains. The hills turned green almost overnight, and the creek that gave the ranch its name swelled with fresh water. The work on the ranch shifted, focused on winterizing, on making sure the cattle had adequate shelter, on preparing for the months ahead. The riding lessons continued, now inside the barn when the weather was poor. Tabitha learning to groom horses properly, to check for injuries, to understand the creatures she was learning to ride. She took to it all with enthusiasm, her hands growing more confident, her fear diminishing. And somewhere along the way, without either of them quite meaning for it to happen, they became friends. It was Tabitha who started the tradition of bringing coffee out to the corral, 2 tin cups balanced carefully in her hands, joining Declan for a few minutes before or after the lessons to just talk. It was Tabitha who convinced him to join the Sunday suppers every week, not just occasionally. It was Tabitha who slowly, gently, drew him back into the world of the living, and Declan found himself wanting to be drawn. By mid-November, Tabitha was riding well enough that Declan suggested they go on a real trail ride, out into the hills beyond the immediate ranch property. She agreed immediately, her excitement palpable, and they set out one clear Saturday morning when both of them had the day free. They rode side by side through the golden grass, the Pacific Ocean visible in the distance, a blue line against the horizon. The air smelled of sage and salt, and the sky was so clear it almost hurt to look at. It was the kind of day that made a person grateful to be alive, and Declan felt something in his chest loosening, some tightness he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. They stopped for lunch by a creek, letting the horses drink and graze while they sat on a fallen log and shared the food Rosa had packed for them, sandwiches and apples and cookies that tasted like cinnamon and home. "This place is beautiful," Tabitha said, looking around with wonder. "I am so glad I came here. I was terrified, leaving San Francisco. It was the only home I had ever known, but this feels right, like I was meant to be here." "I am glad you came," Declan said quietly, the words out before he could stop them. She looked at him, surprise and something else flickering across her face. "Are you?" "Yes," he met her eyes, held her gaze. "You have been good for this place, for the ranch, for everyone." "Even for you?" she asked softly. He wanted to lie, to deflect, to protect himself. But he was tired of hiding, tired of silence. "Especially for me," he admitted. Her smile was gentle, understanding. "You have been good for me too, Declan. You make me feel safe. You listen without judging. You let me talk about my father without trying to fix it or make it better. That means more than you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, eating their lunch, watching the horses, listening to the creek burble over stones. It felt peaceful, right, like something Declan had been missing without knowing it. Finally, Tabitha said, "Can I ask you about your brother?" You do not have to answer, but I would like to understand if you are willing to share. Declan's first instinct was to shut down, to change the subject, to retreat. But he had been carrying this alone for so long, and maybe it was time to let someone else help carry the weight. His name was Danny, he began, the words rough. He was 22, 4 years younger than me. He was funny and reckless and so full of life it sometimes seemed like he could not be contained. Everyone loved him. Tabitha waited, not pushing, just listening. I tried to take care of him after our father died, tried to keep him on the straight path. But Danny was stubborn and he thought he was invincible. He got into gambling, drinking, running with a rough crowd in town. Declan's hands clenched. I warned him. I told him it would end badly. We had a fight the morning he died. I said terrible things, things I can never take back. And he rode into town angry, and he got into a card game, and someone accused him of cheating, and there was a fight, and he was shot. His voice broke on the last word, and he had to stop, had to breathe, had to fight the wave of guilt and grief that threatened to drown him. Tabitha's hand found his, her fingers squeezing gently. It was not your fault. I should have stopped him, should have gone with him, should have said something different, something that would have made him stay. You cannot control another person's choices, Tabitha said firmly. No matter how much you love them, no matter how hard you try. Your brother made his own decisions and the consequences were tragic, but they were not your fault. I stopped talking because words had failed, Declan said, the truth pouring out now. Because everything I said to him that morning was useless, was worse than useless. I realized that words were meaningless, that they could not protect anyone, could not change anything, so I just stopped. But words are not meaningless, Tabitha insisted. Your silence did not bring him back. It did not protect you from pain. It just isolated you, locked you away where no one could reach you, and that is its own kind of death. Declan looked at her, saw the fierce compassion in her eyes, the understanding, and something inside him broke open completely, all the grief and guilt and fear spilling out. I miss him, he whispered. I miss him so much. I know, Tabitha said, and she squeezed his hand tighter. I know. And they sat there by the creek, hands clasped. Two people who had lost the people they loved most, trying to figure out how to keep living anyway. After that day by the creek, something shifted between them. The friendship that had been growing took on a deeper dimension, an intimacy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. They sought each other out more often, finding excuses to spend time together, to talk, to simply be in each other's presence. Declan found himself telling Tabitha stories about Danny, the good memories this time, the funny moments, the times when his brother's reckless energy had been joyful rather than destructive. And in the telling, he found a kind of healing, a way to remember his brother without the weight of guilt crushing him. Tabitha shared more about her father, about his love of poetry and philosophy, about how he had encouraged her education in ways that were unusual for women of their time, about how she had read every book in his shop, sometimes twice, and how she still dreamed of writing something meaningful someday. What would you write about? Declan asked one afternoon as they groomed horses together in the barn, the rhythmic work soothing, the smell of hay and horse familiar and comforting. I do not know yet, she admitted. Maybe about this place, about the ranch, about the people who work so hard to make a life in this wild, beautiful country. There is something noble about it, something worth documenting. You should write it, Declan said, meaning it. You have a way with words. I have heard you talking to Uncle Porter the way you describe things. It is like you paint pictures with language. She blushed, pleased. That is kind of you to say. Maybe I will, someday when I am feeling brave enough. You are already brave, he said. You left everything you knew to come here to start over. That takes courage. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "So did you. You started speaking again, started letting people in. That is its own kind of bravery." He wanted to kiss her. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt, sudden and shocking and undeniable. He wanted to close the distance between them, to feel her lips against his, to show her with actions what he struggled to say with words. But he did not. He was just a ranch hand, and she was Porter's niece, educated and refined, so far above him in station that the thought of courting her seemed presumptuous. He had no right to want her, no right to hope. So he stepped back, put distance between them, and finished grooming the horse with more focus than the task required. If Tabitha noticed his sudden withdrawal, she did not comment on it. But something in her expression shifted, became more guarded, and Declan cursed himself for being a coward. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy on the ranch. There were cattle to move to winter pastures, equipment to repair, 100 tasks that required attention before the deeper winter set in. Declan threw himself into the work with renewed energy, trying to distract himself from his increasingly complicated feelings for Tabitha. But she was everywhere. At meals, her laughter filling the dining room. In the barn, feeding sugar cubes to the horses. On the veranda, reading in the afternoon sun. He could not escape her, and worse, he did not really want to, Porter noticed, of course. The man was observant, and one evening after supper he pulled Declan aside, his expression serious. "Walk with me," Porter said, and it was not a request. They walked out toward the corral, the evening air crisp and cold, their breath puffing out in small clouds. Porter was quiet for a long moment, and Declan waited, wondering if he was about to be fired or warned off, or told to keep his distance from Tabitha. Finally, Porter said, "My niece has grown fond of you." Declan's heart lurched. "Sir, I have not done anything inappropriate. I have been respectful." "I know that," Porter said, his tone mild. "That is not what concerns me. What concerns me is that I see the way you look at her, and the way she looks at you, and I see two people dancing around something that should be simple, but is complicated by circumstances and station and fear." Declan did not know what to say to that. Porter stopped walking, turned to face him. "Declan, you have been like a son to me since you came to this ranch 10 years ago. I watched you grow into a fine man, watched you weather grief that would have broken lesser people. I know your character and I trust you." "Thank you, sir," Declan managed. "Tabitha is precious to me. She is all I have left of my brother's family, and I want her to be happy. And I think, perhaps, you could make her happy if you were brave enough to try." Declan stared at him, stunned. "Sir, I am just a ranch hand. She deserves better. She deserves someone who sees her for who she is, who respects her mind as much as her beauty, who treats her like an equal. And from what I have observed, that describes you perfectly." Porter's eyes were kind but firm. "Do not assume you know what she wants or deserves. Ask her. Talk to her. Be honest. Let her make her own choices." "And if she says no," Declan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "then you will deal with that with grace and dignity, and you will remain friends and life will go on. But I do not think she will say no, Declan. I think she is waiting for you to ask." With that, Porter clapped him on the shoulder and walked back toward the house, leaving Declan standing alone in the dark, his mind reeling. Could it be true? Could Tabitha actually want him the way he wanted her? It seemed impossible, too good to be true. But Porter was not a man given to flights of fancy or empty encouragement. If he said it, he believed it. Declan stood there for a long time, watching the stars emerge overhead, trying to gather his courage. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would talk to her, would be honest, would be brave. Tomorrow. But tomorrow came, and Declan lost his nerve. He saw Tabitha at breakfast and managed only a nod before retreating to his work. He saw her in the afternoon and made excuses about urgent tasks that needed attention. He saw her at supper and was so quiet and withdrawn that even Rosa gave him concerned looks. After supper, Tabitha cornered him on the veranda before he could escape. "Declan Zimmerman, you have been avoiding me all day. Did I do something to offend you?" Her directness caught him off guard. "No, of course not." "Then why are you acting so strange?" She crossed her arms, her expression both hurt and annoyed. "I thought we were friends. Friends do not run away from each other." "We are friends," he said quickly. "That is not it at all." "Then what is it?" She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "Please just talk to me. I cannot stand this distance between us." And there it was, the opening, the moment he had been both dreading and hoping for. He could retreat, could make up some excuse, could protect himself from potential rejection. Or he could be brave. "I care about you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "More than I should. More than is probably wise. And I do not know what to do about it because you are Porter's niece and I am just a ranch hand and I have no business wanting what I want." Tabitha's eyes went wide, her lips parting in surprise. For a terrible moment, Declan thought he had made a horrible mistake, that he had misread everything, that Porter had been wrong. Then she smiled, a slow, radiant smile that transformed her face. "You absolute fool," she said, but there was no heat in it, only affection. "I have been waiting for you to say something for weeks. I have been giving you every sign I could think of short of throwing myself at you." "You have." He felt dizzy, disoriented. "Yes, Declan, I care about you too. Very much. I thought I was being obvious, but apparently I need to be even more direct." She reached out and took his hands in hers, her grip warm and sure. "I am falling in love with you. There, is that clear enough?" His heart stopped, then started again, racing. "You cannot mean that." "I absolutely mean it. Why would I say it otherwise? Because I am nobody. I have nothing to offer you. You could do so much better." "Stop telling me what I deserve," she said, her tone firm. "I am a grown woman, perfectly capable of making my own decisions, and I choose you, Declan Zimmerman. If you will have me," if he would have her, as if there were any doubt, as if he had not been dreaming of exactly this moment while telling himself it was impossible. "I am in love with you," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I have been for weeks. Maybe since that first supper when your laugh cracked me open and reminded me I was still alive." Her eyes glistened with tears, happy ones. "Then kiss me, you stubborn man." He did not need to be told twice. He pulled her close, one hand cupping her face, the other wrapping around her waist, and he kissed her with all the pent-up longing and fear and hope that had been building inside him. She melted against him, her arms coming up around his neck, kissing him back with equal fervor, and it was perfect, better than he had imagined, like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Tabitha laughed, that same beautiful, genuine laugh that had started all of this. "I knew there was passion under all that silence," she teased. "You have no idea," he said, and kissed her again, softer this time, tender, trying to pour all his feelings into the gesture. They stood there on the veranda, wrapped in each other's arms until the cold finally drove them inside. But even then, they were reluctant to separate, hands clasped, stealing glances, both a little dazed by the speed and intensity of what had just happened. Porter found them like that, standing in the hallway, and he just shook his head with a knowing smile. "About time," he said, and walked past them toward his study. The weeks between Declan's confession and Christmas passed in a haze of happiness. They were not secret about their courtship. There was no point in trying to hide it on a ranch where everyone knew everyone else's business, but they were discreet, mindful of propriety and Tabitha's reputation. They spent as much time together as work allowed. riding out into the hills, talking for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories, hopes, fears, and dreams. Declan told her more about his childhood, about his parents, about the lessons his father had taught him about horses and honor and hard work. Tabitha shared her dreams of writing, her love of books, her complicated feelings about leaving San Francisco and starting over. And slowly, Declan felt himself healing. The grief over his brother did not disappear. He knew it never truly would, but it became bearable, integrated into who he was rather than consuming him. He could remember Danny now with a smile more often than with tears, could talk about him without feeling like he was drowning. Tabitha did that for him. Her love, her presence, her unwavering belief that he was worthy of happiness. It gave him permission to forgive himself, to let go of the guilt, to live again. And he did the same for her, he realized. She blossomed under his attention, became more confident, more settled. The restless grief that had driven her to Ventura began to ease, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. She was home, and she knew it. Christmas came, and the ranch celebrated with a feast that would have fed twice their number. The dining room was decorated with pine boughs and candles, and everyone, family and hired hands alike, gathered to share the meal and exchange small gifts. It was warm and joyful, and Declan found himself grateful in ways he had not been in a very long time. After supper, he pulled Tabitha outside, away from the crowd, needing a moment alone with her. She came willingly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold, her breath puffing out in small clouds. "I have something for you," Declan said, suddenly nervous. He pulled a small package from his pocket, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Tabitha's eyes lit up. "You did not have to get me anything. I wanted to." She carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small book bound in leather, its pages blank. "A journal. For your writing," Declan explained. "You said you wanted to document this place, these people. I thought maybe having a proper journal would help you start." Tabitha looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me," she whispered. "Thank you, Declan. Thank you so much." "Does this mean you like it?" he asked, teasing gently. "I love it, almost as much as I love you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, pouring his heart into it, and she kissed him back, her arms wrapping around him, holding him close. "I have something for you too," she said when they finally broke apart. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a pocket watch, silver and beautiful, with his initials engraved on the back. "It was my father's," Tabitha said quietly. "One of the few things I brought with me from San Francisco. I want you to have it." Declan stared at the watch, overwhelmed. "Tabitha, I cannot take this. It is too precious." "That is exactly why I want you to have it. You brought me back to life, Declan. You gave me hope when I had none. This watch represents time, the time my father and I had together, the time he taught me to value every moment. And now I want to share that with you, to remind you that time is precious, that life is precious, that we have to live it fully while we can." He could not speak past the lump in his throat, so he just pulled her close and held her, this incredible woman who had walked into his life and changed everything. As winter deepened, Declan and Tabitha's relationship deepened as well. They talked about the future, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. They both wanted the same things: a life on the ranch, a home, a family. Tabitha loved the work she was doing managing the household and accounts, and she had no desire to return to city life. Declan could not imagine being anywhere else, doing anything else. The question was not if they would marry, but when. Porter solved that question for them one evening in January. He called them both into his study, his expression serious, and for a moment Declan feared something was wrong. But then Porter smiled and the worry evaporated. "I have been thinking," Porter said, "about the future of this ranch. I am not getting any younger and I have no children of my own to leave it to. I had always hoped James would take over, but God had other plans." He paused, looking between them. "Declan, you have been like a son to me. You know this place as well as I do. You understand the work, the land, the animals. And Tabitha, you have brought new life to this ranch, new organization and efficiency. Together, I think the two of you could run this place better than I ever did." Declan frowned, not understanding. "Sir, I am offering you a partnership," Porter said bluntly. "You two marry, and I will make you both equal partners in the Double Creek Ranch. When I die, it will be yours entirely. This is your home, and it should be your legacy." Declan was stunned into silence. It was too much, too generous, more than he had ever dared hope for. But Tabitha spoke up, her voice clear. "Uncle Samuel, that is incredibly generous, but we need to be certain this is what you truly want, not something you feel obligated to do." "It is exactly what I want," Porter assured her. "I have no family left except you, Tabitha. And Declan is the son I never had. I want to know that when I am gone, this ranch will be in good hands, that it will continue to thrive. There is no one I trust more than the two of you." Declan found his voice finally. "Sir, I do not know what to say. Thank you. This is more than I ever dreamed of." "Say you will take care of each other," Porter said. "Say you will build a good life here. That is all the thanks I need." "We will," Tabitha promised, her hand finding Declan's and squeezing tight. "We absolutely will." They were married in early March of 1879, almost exactly a year after Declan had stopped speaking, in a simple ceremony at the ranch. The weather cooperated beautifully, giving them a warm, clear day with wildflowers blooming across the hills. The few guests included the ranch hands, Miguel and Rosa and their extended family, and a handful of neighbors and friends from town. Tabitha wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was pinned up with wildflowers woven through the dark strands, and she looked more beautiful than Declan had ever seen anyone look. He wore his best suit, brushed and pressed, his hair properly cut for the occasion. His hands shook as he waited for her to walk down the makeshift aisle set up in the yard, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. But when Tabitha appeared, escorted by her uncle, all the nervousness fell away. She was smiling at him, her eyes shining with love and joy, and Declan knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that they were meant for this, for each other. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Declan kissed his bride with all the love and hope he had in him, and the small crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed was joyful and boisterous. Rosa had outdone herself with the food, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter and toasts that grew increasingly sentimental as the afternoon wore on. Miguel raised his glass and said, "To Declan and Tabitha, who prove that even the quietest man can find his voice when he finds the right woman to speak to." Everyone drank to that, and Declan felt his eyes sting with grateful tears. Later, as the sun was setting and the guests were beginning to drift away, Tabitha pulled him aside. "Happy husband, happier than I have any right to be," he admitted. "You have given me back my life, Tabitha. I will spend the rest of my days trying to deserve you." "You already do," she assured him. "And I am just as grateful. You showed me that grief does not have to be the end, that it is possible to find joy again, to build something new. We are going to have a beautiful life together, Declan Zimmerman. I am sure of it." "Tabitha Zimmerman now," he corrected with a grin. "Tabitha Zimmerman," she repeated, testing it out. "I like that very much. And she kissed him again, sweet and full of promise, as the California sun painted the sky orange and gold, and somewhere in the hills, a meadowlark sang its evening song. The early months of their marriage were an adjustment, but a joyful one. They moved into the small foreman's house on the ranch, a two-room cabin that had been empty since Miguel and Rosa had moved into the main house years before. It was modest but comfortable, and they spent happy hours fixing it up, making it their own. Tabitha hung curtains and planted flowers in boxes under the windows. Declan built bookshelves for her growing collection and repaired the leaky roof. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day. He with the horses and cattle, she with the accounts and household management, and coming together in the evenings to share meals and conversation and the quiet intimacy of a life shared. Tabitha began writing in earnest, filling the journal Declan had given her with observations and stories about ranch life. She showed him some of what she wrote, her descriptions so vivid and true that he could see the people she wrote about coming to life on the page. She had real talent, and he encouraged her to consider sending some pieces to magazines or newspapers. "Maybe someday," she said, "when I am feeling brave." "You are the bravest person I know," he told her, meaning every word. Declan continued working with the horses, but with his new partnership status, he was also more involved in the broader management of the ranch. He and Porter worked together to plan for the future, to make improvements, to ensure the ranch would thrive for generations to come. It was fulfilling work, purposeful, and Declan felt more settled than he ever had. And through it all, he talked. Not constantly, he would never be a chatterbox, but he no longer feared words. He had learned that silence could be a refuge, but it could also be a prison, and that words, even imperfect ones, were how people connected, how they built relationships, how they loved. The summer of 1879 was hot and dry, the kind of weather that made everyone move slowly and seek shade in the heat of the day. Tabitha spent long afternoons in the relative cool of the cabin, writing, while Declan worked with the cattle, making sure they had access to water as the creeks began to run low. In August, Tabitha began feeling unwell. At first she thought it was just the heat, but when the nausea persisted and she began feeling tired all the time, Rosa took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "You are with child," the older woman announced with certainty. Tabitha stared at her, shocked. They had not been trying to prevent it, but she had not expected it to happen so quickly. "Are you sure? I have raised 6 children and helped birth 24 more," Rosa said with a laugh. "I am sure." When Tabitha told Declan that evening, he was speechless for a long moment, his eyes going wide, his mouth opening and closing without sound. For a brief, terrifying second, Tabitha worried he was not happy about it. Then he whooped with joy, picked her up, and spun her around despite her laughing protests, his face split with the widest grin she had ever seen. "We are having a baby," he kept repeating as if he could not quite believe it. "A baby. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he said, setting her down carefully, his hands gentle on her arms. Terrified, excited, overwhelmed, grateful, all of it. But yes, so happy, Tabitha. So incredibly happy. The months of her pregnancy were both wonderful and challenging. Tabitha suffered through bouts of nausea and exhaustion, but as she moved into her second trimester, she began to feel better, even energized. Her body changed in ways that fascinated and sometimes frightened her. But Declan was patient and supportive, adapting to her needs, taking on extra work so she could rest, bringing her tea and crackers when the nausea was bad. Porter was delighted at the prospect of a great niece or nephew, and he began making plans for expanding the cabin into a proper house, something large enough for a growing family. Declan protested that it was too much, but Porter was adamant. "This is your home now," the older man said. "Your child deserves to grow up in a place with room to run and play. Let me do this." Construction began in the fall, with skilled carpenters from town coming to help. The cabin was expanded, gaining a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, a sitting room, and an upstairs loft that could eventually be divided into more bedrooms. It was beautiful and solid, built to last, and watching it take shape made the coming baby feel even more real. As winter set in and Tabitha's belly grew round and prominent, she nested with a vengeance, organizing the new house, sewing baby clothes and preparing for the arrival. Rosa became her constant companion and advisor, sharing wisdom from her own experiences, calming Tabitha's fears, and helping her understand what to expect. Declan was a wreck of nerves, constantly worrying about Tabitha's health, about whether they were prepared, about whether he would be a good father. She reassured him as best she could, but some fears could only be put to rest by experience. The baby arrived in early March of 1880, 2 years almost to the day after Declan and Tabitha's first meeting. Labor was long and difficult, and Declan wore a path in the floor pacing while Rosa and the midwife attended to Tabitha. He had never felt so helpless in his life, hearing her cries of pain, unable to do anything to ease her suffering. But then, finally, there was a different kind of cry, a tiny, furious wail that cut through everything else, and Rosa emerged from the bedroom with a huge smile. "You have a son," she announced, "a healthy, strong boy with good lungs." Declan's knees nearly gave out. A son. He had a son. He was allowed into the bedroom a few minutes later, and the sight that met him stole his breath. Tabitha was propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, and cradled in her arms was the tiniest, most perfect creature Declan had ever seen. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. "Meet your son," Tabitha said, her voice hoarse but joyful. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Declan knew exactly what the name should be. "Daniel," he said quietly, "after my brother, if that is acceptable to you." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears. "Daniel Zimmerman. It is perfect. Your brother would be honored." Declan sat carefully on the edge of the bed and with shaking hands took his son from Tabitha's arms. The baby was warm and solid, surprisingly heavy, and as Declan looked down at him, Daniel opened his eyes, dark blue and unfocused, seeming to stare right at his father. "Hello, Danny," Declan whispered. "Welcome to the world. I am your father, and I promise I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and loved." And as he said the words, Declan felt the last piece of his broken heart click back into place. He had lost his brother, would always carry that grief, but here was a new Daniel, a new beginning, a chance to honor his brother's memory by being the best father he could be. Tabitha reached out and took his hand, squeezing tight. "We are a family," she said. "Yes," Declan agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "We are." The years that followed were full and rich. Daniel grew from a tiny infant into a toddler, then a sturdy little boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. He was curious and bright and full of energy, keeping both his parents on their toes. The ranch thrived under Declan and Tabitha's management. They implemented new practices, improved the breeding stock, expanded the operation carefully and sustainably. Porter officially retired from active management, content to spend his days reading on the veranda and playing with his great-nephew. And the ranch became known as one of the best-run operations in Ventura County. Tabitha continued her writing, and with Declan's encouragement, she finally submitted some of her work to a San Francisco magazine. To her shock and delight, they accepted 3 of her essays about ranch life and paid her for them. More publications followed, and she began building a modest reputation as a writer who could capture the reality of Western life with honesty and warmth. In the spring of 1882, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Ruth after Declan's mother. She was tiny and delicate, with her mother's features, and Declan fell completely in love with her the moment he held her. Daniel, now 2, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and the house rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing. 2 more children followed in the years after that, another son named Thomas in 1884, and a second daughter named Sarah in 1886. The house they had built proved to be exactly the right size. The upstairs loft divided into bedrooms for the children, the kitchen constantly busy with meals and baking, the yard full of toys and laughter. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, the constant work that ranching demanded. Samuel Porter passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1885, leaving them the ranch as promised, and both Declan and Tabitha grieved the loss of the man who had been father and mentor to them both. But they weathered it all together, supporting each other through the hard times, celebrating the good times, building a life that was deeply rooted and purposeful. And Declan never forgot what silence had cost him, or what Tabitha's laugh had given back. He made sure to tell his children every day that he loved them, to use his words to encourage and guide and connect. He talked to Tabitha every evening, sharing his thoughts and feelings, asking about hers, maintaining the intimacy that had drawn them together in the first place. On their 10th wedding anniversary in March of 1889, they took an evening walk together, just the 2 of them, leaving the children in Rosa's capable care. They walked out to the spot where Declan had first kissed her, where he had told her he loved her, and they stood there looking out over the ranch they had built together. "You ever regret it?" Tabitha asked. "Marrying me, taking on all this responsibility?" Declan looked at her in genuine surprise. "Never, not once. You gave me everything, Tabitha. A voice, a purpose, a family, a life worth living. I am the luckiest man alive." "I am the lucky one," she countered. "You saved me, Declan. I was drowning in grief, and you gave me a reason to swim." "We saved each other," he said, taking her hand. "That is what love does." She leaned against him, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the California hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance, their children were laughing, and closer a horse whinnied, and the wind carried the scent of sage and growing things. "I wrote about us," Tabitha said suddenly. "About how we met, how you stopped talking, and how I made you laugh. I sent it to a publisher in New York, a real book publisher. They want to publish it as a novel." Declan turned to her, eyes wide. "Tabitha, that is amazing. Why did you not tell me?" "I wanted to be sure it was real, not just get your hopes up, but they sent a contract and an advance payment." "It is really happening." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Our story is going to be a book that people can read." He pulled her close and kissed her, pouring a decade of love and gratitude into the gesture. "I am so proud of you. You worked so hard for this." "I could not have done it without you," she said. "You are my inspiration, my muse, my everything." They stood there as the stars began to emerge, 2 people who had found each other in grief and built something beautiful together. And Declan thought about the man he had been that March day in 1878, silent and broken, certain he would never feel whole again. He had been so wrong. Life was not about avoiding pain or hiding from grief. It was about finding reasons to keep going, about letting people in, about having the courage to love even when love meant risking loss. Tabitha had taught him that. Her laugh had cracked him open, and what had spilled out was not just pain, but also the capacity for joy, for connection, for a future he had thought was lost forever. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, toward the warm light spilling from the windows, toward the sounds of their children getting ready for bed, toward the life they had built together, Declan said a silent prayer of gratitude, for second chances, for love that heals, for a woman whose laughter saved his life, and for the courage to speak again. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. Daniel, the eldest, showed his father's gift with horses and spent hours in the corral learning to train and gentle the animals. Ruth was bookish like her mother, often found curled up in corners with a book or helping Tabitha with her writing. Thomas was the adventurous one, always exploring the farthest reaches of the ranch, coming home with scraped knees and wild stories. Sarah, the youngest, was a perfect blend of all of them, loving horses and books and adventure in equal measure. Tabitha's novel, titled The Silent Season, was published in 1890 to modest but warm reception. It told a fictionalized version of their story, and readers responded to the honest portrayal of grief and healing, of love found in unexpected places. She wrote more after that, novels and essays, building a career that brought in additional income and gave her deep satisfaction. Declan continued to manage the ranch, expanding their operation carefully, earning a reputation throughout California as a fair employer and skilled rancher. He mentored young cowboys, teaching them not just the practical skills but also the importance of treating animals with respect and workers with dignity. They added to the house over the years as their family grew, building a proper library for Tabitha's books and a larger barn for Declan's horses. The ranch became known as a welcoming place, where neighbors were always invited for Sunday supper, where ranch hands were treated like family, where children grew up loved and secure. In the summer of 1895, when Daniel was 15 and beginning to take on more responsibility on the ranch, Declan took him on a ride out to his uncle's grave. It was something he had been meaning to do for years, but the time had never felt quite right. Now, with his son on the cusp of manhood, it seemed important. They rode in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from knowing each other well and not needing to fill every moment with words. When they reached the small cemetery outside Ventura, Declan dismounted and stood before the weathered headstone that marked his brother's resting place. Daniel stood beside him, respectful and quiet, waiting. "This is your Uncle Danny," Declan said. "My brother. You are named after him." "I know," Daniel said. "Mother told me the story." "He was reckless and funny and full of life," Declan continued. "He made mistakes, bad ones, and they cost him everything. For a long time I blamed myself for not saving him, for not saying the right words that would have kept him safe." "But it was not your fault," Daniel said, echoing the words Tabitha had spoken so many years ago. "No, it was not. But it took me a long time to understand that, and in the process of learning I nearly destroyed myself. I stopped talking for 7 months, thinking silence would protect me from more pain." Declan looked at his son, this young man who carried his uncle's name and his father's eyes. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand something important. You cannot control other people's choices, no matter how much you love them. You can guide and advise and support, but ultimately, everyone has to make their own decisions and live with the consequences." Daniel nodded, absorbing this. "But you can control how you respond," Declan continued. You can choose to let grief consume you, or you can choose to honor the people you have lost by living fully, by loving deeply, by not hiding from life. I chose hiding for a while, and it nearly cost me everything. Your mother saved me from that." "She is pretty great," Daniel agreed with a small smile. "She is," Declan said. "And so are you, son. I am proud of the young man you are becoming. Your uncle would have loved you." They stood there for a while longer, paying respects, then mounted up and rode back to the ranch. The conversation had been important, necessary, a passing down of wisdom earned through hard experience. That evening, over dinner with the whole family gathered around the table, Declan looked at each face, each person he loved, and felt a contentment so complete it almost hurt. Tabitha caught his eye and smiled, understanding, as she always did, what he was feeling. After the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill, watching the stars emerge. "You talked to Daniel about Danny today," Tabitha said. It was not a question. "How did you know?" "I know you, and I saw the look on his face when you returned. It was a good conversation, I think." "I hope so. I wanted him to understand why we named him that, wanted him to know the man he was named after, both the good and the bad." "That was wise," Tabitha said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You have become such a wonderful father, Declan. Your brother would be proud of who you have become." "I hope so," Declan said quietly. "I think about him often, wonder what kind of life he might have had if he had made different choices. But I do not blame myself anymore. You taught me that." "We taught each other," she corrected. "That is what we do. We keep each other balanced, keep each other growing." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you, Tabitha Zimmerman. More today than yesterday, more tomorrow than today. And I love you, Declan Zimmerman, my silent cowboy who found his voice." They sat there until the cold drove them inside, then climbed the stairs to their bedroom, where they held each other close and fell asleep in the safety of each other's arms. The turn of the century came, bringing with it new technologies and changes to ranch life. Automobiles began appearing on the roads, though Declan remained skeptical of them, preferring horses. Telephones connected ranches to town, making communication easier. The world was changing, becoming smaller and faster, but some things remained constant: the land, the work, family, love. Daniel grew into a fine young man, and at 22, married a neighboring rancher's daughter named Catherine. They built a house on the far end of the ranch property and began their own family. Ruth went to college, one of the few women of her generation to do so, and returned with a degree in literature and a determination to follow in her mother's footsteps as a writer. Thomas joined the cavalry, seeking adventure beyond the ranch, though he promised to return someday. Sarah, the baby, was still at home at 14, helping her mother and learning the business of ranch management. Declan and Tabitha, now in their 40s, settled into a comfortable rhythm, proud of the children they had raised, grateful for the life they had built. They still took their evening walks, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still found ways to make each other laugh. On a warm spring afternoon in 1902, almost exactly 24 years after that first Sunday supper, they rode out to their favorite spot overlooking the ranch. It had become tradition to come here on their anniversary, to remember where they started, to appreciate how far they had come. 24 years, Tabitha marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. "I cannot imagine life without you," Declan said. "I barely remember the man I was before you." "He was a good man who had lost his way," Tabitha said. "I am glad I could help you find it again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren, Daniel's 2 boys, playing in the yard far below. The ranch stretched out before them, golden in the afternoon sun, prosperous and thriving. "You ever think about that first supper?" Declan asked. "When you laughed and I spoke for the first time in months?" "All the time," Tabitha admitted. "It was the moment everything changed, for both of us, I think." "Your laugh cracked me open like a walnut," Declan said, repeating the words he had told her many times over the years. All the grief and pain I had been holding in came pouring out, but so did the ability to feel joy again, to hope, to love. "You saved my life that night, Tabitha." "And you saved mine," she countered. "We were both drowning, both lost, but we found each other, and that made all the difference." Declan took her hand, lacing their fingers together, marveling at how perfectly they fit after all these years. "I would do it all again, every moment, every struggle, just to end up here with you. Even the silent months," she teased gently. "Even those," he confirmed. "Because they led me to you, and you were worth the journey." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, they mounted their horses and rode back to the house, back to the family and the life they had built together. Behind them, their shadows stretched long across the grass, two figures moving as one, perfectly matched, perfectly paired. That evening, surrounded by children and grandchildren at the dinner table, the house filled with laughter and conversation and love, Declan looked across at his wife and caught her eye. She smiled at him, that same radiant smile that had captured his heart all those years ago, and he smiled back. No words were needed. They understood each other completely, the silent communication of two people who had spent decades learning each other's thoughts and feelings. But later, when they were alone in their room, preparing for bed, Declan pulled Tabitha close and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for laughing that night. Thank you for cracking me open. Thank you for loving me when I was too broken to love myself." Tabitha turned in his arms, her eyes soft with emotion. "Thank you for having the courage to speak, for letting me in, for building this beautiful life with me. I could not have asked for a better partner, a better husband, a better father for my children." They held each other close, two people who had found healing in love, who had transformed grief into joy, who had taken broken pieces and created something whole and beautiful. Outside, the California stars shone bright, and somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied softly. The ranch slept, peaceful and secure, built on a foundation of love and hard work and second chances. And in the morning, they would wake and do it all again, living each day with intention and gratitude, never taking for granted the miracle of having found each other. The cowboy, who had not spoken for 7 months, had learned to use his voice again, and he used it to tell his wife every day that he loved her, to guide his children, to build a legacy that would outlast him. And it all started with a laugh at supper, a moment of pure joy that cracked open a heart that had been locked tight, letting the light back in. That was the real miracle, Declan thought as sleep claimed him, Tabitha warm and solid beside him. Not that they had found love, but that they had been brave enough to accept it when it came, to nurture it, to let it grow into something larger than either of them alone. That was the story. That was the life. And it was, in every way that mattered, a happy ending. Years continued to pass, as they do, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that make up a full life. Declan and Tabitha celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th, growing older together with grace, their love deepening rather than diminishing with time. Thomas returned from his time in the cavalry, more settled and mature, and took over managing the cattle operations. He married a teacher from Ventura, a spirited woman named Alina who fit perfectly into the family. Sarah, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a skilled horsewoman, eventually taking over the training program her father had built. Ruth published her first novel at 30, dedicated to her parents, who showed me what love looks like. Daniel and Catherine's family grew to include 5 children, filling the ranch with another generation of laughter and energy. In 1908, on a cool October evening, Declan and Tabitha sat on their porch, now in their mid-50s, watching the sunset. Declan's hair was threaded with silver now, and Tabitha wore reading glasses when she worked on her writing, but they were still healthy and active, still engaged in the life of the ranch. "You remember what today is?" Tabitha asked. Declan thought for a moment, then smiled. 30 years since that first Sunday supper, since you laughed and broke my silence." "I thought you might forget," she said, pleased that he remembered. "I never forget the important things," he said, taking her hand. "That night changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn colors, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the evening. From inside the house came the sounds of their youngest grandchildren playing, visiting with their parents for the weekend. "We have had a good life," Tabitha said contentedly. "The best life," Declan agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible during those silent months." "Tell me again," Tabitha said, as she sometimes did when she was feeling nostalgic. "Tell me what you were thinking that night when I laughed." Declan closed his eyes, remembering. "I was watching you, trying not to be obvious about it, and Rosa told that story about her grandson and the chickens. And you laughed, really laughed, with your whole self. It was like music after months of nothing but silence in my head. And I felt something crack inside me, like ice breaking in spring, and suddenly the words were there again, waiting to come out. I was terrified and relieved and so overwhelmed I could barely breathe." "And you said, 'That is a good story,'" Tabitha quoted, her voice soft with memory. 5 words. That is all it took to break 7 months of silence. 5 simple words, because your joy was so genuine, so alive, that it reminded me I was still alive too, that there was still beauty and laughter in the world, that maybe I could be part of it again. Tabitha leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I am so glad you spoke that night, so glad you were brave enough to risk it." "I am glad you laughed," Declan said. "Glad you came to Ventura. Glad your uncle hired me all those years ago. Glad for every single thing that led us to each other." They stayed there until the stars came out, until the cold drove them inside, until duty called them to help put grandchildren to bed and share stories and kisses goodnight. And that night, lying in bed with Tabitha curled against his side, Declan thought about the journey they had taken together, about the man he had been and the man he had become, about the family they had created and the legacy they were leaving. He thought about his brother Danny, long gone but never forgotten, and he hoped that wherever Danny was, he knew that his nephew carried his name with honor, that he was remembered with love despite his mistakes, that his death, though tragic, had ultimately led to something beautiful. Because grief and joy were not opposites, Declan had learned. They were partners, intertwined, each making the other more meaningful. He could not have appreciated the depth of his joy with Tabitha if he had not known the depths of grief over his brother. And he could not honor his brother's memory by hiding from life, but by living it fully, by loving completely, by being present for every precious moment. That was what Tabitha's laugh had taught him. That life was meant to be lived, not endured. That silence might feel like safety, but connection was what made existence worthwhile. That words, imperfect as they might be, were still the best tools humans had for building bridges between souls. Declan fell asleep counting his blessings. His wife's heart beat steady against his chest, and his last thought before sleep claimed him was one of pure gratitude. For second chances, for laughter that heals, for love that endures, for the courage to speak when silence seemed safer. And for the woman who saw him, really saw him, when he was at his most broken and loved him anyway. That was the true gift. That was the miracle. That was the happy ending that was really just a beautiful beginning, continuing day after day, year after year, for as long as they both should live. And it all started with a laugh at supper, 30 years ago, in the fading light of a California evening, when a broken cowboy found his voice again and began the journey back to life.